Section 20 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 20. Typical Dreams. The embarrassment dream of nakedness. Generally speaking, we are not in a position to interpret another person's dream if he is unwilling to furnish us with the unconscious thoughts which lie behind the dream content, and for this reason the practical applicability of our method of dream interpretation is often seriously restricted. But there are dreams which exhibit a complete contrast to the individual's customary liberty to endow his dream world with a special individuality, thereby making it inaccessible to an alien understanding. There are a number of dreams which almost everyone has dreamed in the same manner, and of which we are accustomed to assume that they have the same significance in the case of every dreamer. A peculiar interest attaches to these typical dreams, because no matter who dreams them, they presumably all derive from the same sources, so that they would seem to be particularly fitted to provide us with information as to the sources of dreams. With quite special expectations, therefore, we shall proceed to test our technique of dream interpretation on these typical dreams, and only with extreme reluctance shall we admit that precisely in respect of this material our method is not fully verified. In the interpretation of typical dreams we, as a rule, fail to obtain those associations from the dreamer which in other cases have led us to comprehension of the dream, or else these associations are confused and inadequate, so that they do not help us to solve our problem. Why this is the case, and how we can remedy this defect in our technique, are points which will be discussed in a later chapter. The reader will then understand why I can deal with only a few of the group of typical dreams in this chapter, and why I have postponed the discussion of the others. A. The embarrassment dream of nakedness. In a dream in which one is naked, or scantily clad in the presence of strangers, it sometimes happens that one is not in the least ashamed of one's condition. But the dream of nakedness demands our attention only when shame and embarrassment are felt in it, when one wishes to escape or to hide, and when one feels the strange inhibition of being unable to stir from the spot, and of being utterly powerless to alter the painful situation. It is only in this connection that the dream is typical. Otherwise, the nucleus of its content may be involved in all sorts of other connections, or may be replaced by individual amplifications. The essential point is that one has a painful feeling of shame, and is anxious to hide one's nakedness, usually by means of locomotion, but is absolutely unable to do so. I believe that the great majority of my readers will at some time have found themselves in this situation in a dream. The nature and manner of the exposure is usually rather vague. The dreamer will say, perhaps, "I was in my chemise," but this is rarely a clear image. In most cases, the lack of clothing is so indeterminate that it is described in narrating the dream by an alternative, "I was in my chemise or my petticoat." As a rule, the deficiency in clothing is not serious enough to justify the feeling of shame attached to it. For a man who has served in the army, nakedness is often replaced by a manner of dressing that is contrary to regulations. "I was in the street without my saber, and I saw some officers approaching," or "I had no collar," or "I was wearing checked civilian trousers," etc. The persons before whom one is ashamed are almost always strangers, whose faces remain indeterminate. It never happens, in the typical dream, that one is reproved or even noticed on account of the lack of clothing, which causes one such embarrassment. On the contrary, the people in the dream appear to be quite indifferent. Or, as I was able to note in one particularly vivid dream, they have stiff and solemn expressions. This gives us food for thought. The dreamer's embarrassment and the spectator's indifference constitute a contradiction such as often occurs in dreams. It would be more in keeping with the dreamer's feelings if the strangers were to look at him in astonishment, or were to laugh at him, or be outraged. I think, however, that this obnoxious feature has been displaced by wish fulfillment, while the embarrassment is for some reason retained, so that the two components are not in agreement. We have an interesting proof that the dream which is partially distorted by wish fulfillment has not been properly understood, for it has been made the basis of a fairy tale familiar to us all in Andersen's version of the Emperor's New Clothes, and it has more recently received poetical treatment by Fulda in The Talisman. In Andersen's fairy tale we are told of two impostors who weave a costly garment for the Emperor, which shall, however, be visible only to the good and true. The Emperor goes forth clad to this invisible garment, and since the imaginary fabric serves as a sort of touchstone, the people are frightened into behaving as though they did not notice the Emperor's nakedness. But this is really the situation in our dream. It is not very venturesome to assume that the unintelligible dream content has provided an incentive to invent a state of undress which gives meaning to the situation present in the memory. This situation is thereby robbed of its original meaning and made to serve alien ends. But we shall see that such a misunderstanding of the dream content often occurs through the conscious activity of a second psychic system, and is to be recognized as a factor of the final form of the dream. And further, that in the development of obsessions and phobias similar misunderstandings, still of course within the same psychic personality, play a decisive part. It is even possible to specify whence the material for the fresh interpretation of the dream is taken. The impostor is the dream, the Emperor is the dreamer himself, and the moralizing tendency betrays a hazy knowledge of the fact that there is a question, in the latent dream content, of forbidden wishes, victims of repression. The connection in which such dreams appear during my analysis of neurotics proves beyond a doubt that a memory of the dreamer's earliest childhood lies at the foundation of the dream. Only in our childhood was there a time when we were seen by our relatives, as well as by strange nurses, servants, and visitors, in a state of insufficient clothing, and at that time we were not ashamed of our nakedness. In the case of many rather older children it may be observed that being undressed has an exciting effect upon them, instead of making them feel ashamed. They laugh, leap about, slap or thump their own bodies. The mother or whoever is present scolds them, saying, "Fie, that is shameful, you mustn't do that." Children often show a desire to display themselves. It is hardly possible to pass through a village in country districts without meeting a 2- or 3-year-old child who lifts up his or her blouse or frock before the traveler, possibly in his honor. One of my patients has retained in his conscious memory a scene from his 8th year in which, after undressing for bed, he wanted to dance into his little sister's room in his shirt, but was prevented by the servant. In the history of the childhood of neurotics, exposure before children of the opposite sex plays a prominent part. In paranoia, the delusion of being observed while dressing and undressing may be directly traced to these experiences. And among those who have remained perverse, there is a class in whom the childish impulse is accentuated into a symptom, the class of exhibitionists. This age of childhood, in which the sense of shame is unknown, seems a paradise when we look back upon it later, and paradise itself is nothing but the mass fantasy of the childhood of the individual. This is why in paradise men are naked and unashamed, until the moment arrives when shame and fear awaken. Expulsion follows, and sexual life and cultural development begin. Into this paradise dreams can take us back every night. We have already ventured the conjecture that the impressions of our earliest childhood, from the prehistoric period until about the end of the 3rd year, crave reproduction for their own sake, perhaps without further reference to their content, so that their repetition is a wish fulfillment. Dreams of nakedness, then, are exhibition dreams. The nucleus of an exhibition dream is furnished by one's own person, which is seen not as that of a child, but as it exists in the present, and by the idea of scanty clothing which emerges indistinctly, owing to the superimposition of so many later situations of being partially clothed, or out of consideration for the censorship. To these elements are added the persons in whose presence one is ashamed. I know of no example in which the actual spectators of these infantile exhibitions reappear in a dream, for a dream is hardly ever a simple recollection. Strangely enough, those persons who are the objects of our sexual interest in childhood are omitted from all reproductions, in dreams, in hysteria or in obsessional neurosis. Paranoia alone restores the spectators, and is fanatically convinced of their presence, although they remain unseen. The substitute for these persons offered by the dream, the number of strangers who take no notice of the spectacle offered them, is precisely the counter-wish to that single, intimately known person for whom the exposure was intended. A number of strangers, moreover, often occur in dreams in all sorts of other connections. As a counter-wish they always signify a secret. It will be seen that even that restitution of the old state of affairs that occurs in paranoia complies with this counter tendency. One is no longer alone. One is quite positively being watched. But the spectators are a number of strange, curiously indeterminate people. For obvious reasons, the presence of the whole family in the dream has the same significance. Furthermore, repression finds a place in the exhibition dream. For the disagreeable sensation of the dream is, of course, the reaction on the part of the second psychic instance to the fact that the exhibitionistic scene, which has been condemned by the censorship, has nevertheless succeeded in presenting itself. The only way to avoid this sensation would be to refrain from reviving the scene. In a later chapter we shall deal once again with the feeling of inhibition. In our dreams it represents to perfection a conflict of the will, a denial. According to our unconscious purpose, the exhibition is to proceed. According to the demands of the censorship, it is to come to an end. The relation of our typical dreams to fairy tales and other fiction and poetry is neither sporadic nor accidental. Sometimes the penetrating insight of the poet has analytically recognized the process of transformation of which the poet is otherwise the instrument, and has followed it up in the reverse direction. That is to say, has traced a poem to a dream. A friend has called my attention to the following passage in G. Keller's Der Grüne Heinrich. I do not wish, dear Lee, that you should ever come to realize from experience the exquisite and piquant truth in the situation of Odysseus, when he appears naked and covered with mud, before Nausicaa and her playmates. Would you like to know what it means? Let us for a moment consider the incident closely. If you are ever parted from your home, and from all that is dear to you, and wander about in a strange country, if you have seen much and experienced much, if you have cares and sorrows, and are perhaps utterly wretched and forlorn, you will some night inevitably dream that you are approaching your home. You will see it shining and glittering in the loveliest colors. Lovely and gracious figures will come to meet you. And then you will suddenly discover that you are ragged, naked, and covered with dust. An indescribable feeling of shame and fear overcomes you. You try to cover yourself, to hide, and you wake up bathed in sweat. As long as humanity exists, this will be the dream of the care-laden, tempest-tossed man. And thus Homer has drawn this situation from the profoundest depths of the eternal nature of humanity. What are the profoundest depths of the eternal nature of humanity, which the poet commonly hopes to awaken in his listeners, but these stirrings of the psychic life which are rooted in that age of childhood which subsequently becomes prehistoric? Childish wishes, now suppressed and forbidden, break into the dream behind the unobjectionable and permissibly conscious wishes of the homeless man, and it is for this reason that the dream, which is objectified in the legend of Nausicaa, regularly develops into an anxiety dream. My own dream of hurrying upstairs, which presently changed into being glued to the stairs, is likewise an exhibition dream, for it reveals the essential ingredients of such a dream. It must therefore be possible to trace it back to experiences in my childhood, and the knowledge of these should enable us to conclude how far the servant's behavior to me, that is, her reproach that I had soiled the carpet, helped her to secure the position which she occupies in the dream. Now I am actually able to furnish the desired explanation. One learns in a psychoanalysis to interpret temporal proximity by material connection. Two ideas which are apparently without connection, but which occur in immediate succession, belong to a unity which has to be deciphered. Just as an A and AB, when written in succession, must be pronounced as one syllable, ab, it is just the same with the interrelations of dreams. The dream of the stairs has been taken from a series of dreams with whose other members I am familiar, having interpreted them. A dream included in this series must belong to the same context. Now the other dreams of the series are based on the memory of a nurse to whom I was entrusted for a season, from the time when I was still at the breast to the age of 2½ and of whom a hazy recollection has remained in my consciousness. According to information which I recently obtained from my mother, she was old and ugly, but very intelligent and thorough. According to the inferences which I am justified in drawing from my dreams, she did not always treat me quite kindly, but spoke harshly to me when I showed insufficient understanding of the necessity for cleanliness. Inasmuch as the maid endeavored to continue my education in this respect, she is entitled to be treated, in my dream, as an incarnation of the prehistoric old woman. It is to be assumed, of course, that the child was fond of his teacher in spite of her harsh behavior. End of section 20. Recording by Pamela Krantz.